I'm still working on these front and rear guards, but I'm making a bit more progress now. I've got this one off the car so that we can see how I trimmed the guard. This is sitting upside down, of course, so that it follows the line of the side of the car and the line on the guard there. And then I made this sort of infill piece. This is one piece of steel that's just been curved to follow the shape, and it's got a flange folded on it. I punched through the flange and then just sort of plug welded it to the top of the guard. And since I had the MIG out and I was being fairly lazy, I also just MIG'd all the way along the seam and then ground that all smooth. That won't be seen when it's on the car, of course, because the guard fits up against the body and there will be fender welt between the seam. So if we look at the other side, you can see how that's just sitting there at the moment. Nothing's been bolted on, but that'll be able to be bolted through underneath here, through into that rear guard, and also through into the body, and that'll lock everything together. You can also see here how that's given me the little step that I need between the two guards, and the reason for that is because the rear track width on an Austin 7 is wider than the front. So if I didn't have that there, these guards wouldn't be parallel to each other either side of the car. The other thing I've been doing is I want to remake the rear valance panels that I made. When I first made them, I was originally thinking I would run fender welt down this seam and that seam, but that'll be a bit tricky to do and a bit messy. So because the side of the guard is effectively flat, all the way along here is just a straight line. So I've been making new templates out of builder's paper, so I can cut new sheets of steel and make new valances that fit a lot better. I wasn't quite happy with the finish along here and also at the front. It gets a bit tricky at the front because it narrows down so much. So I'm probably going to extend this just a little bit. But to make these templates, I don't try to make it all in one piece. It's a lot easier because I've already got something there I can lay the paper down on top of. But I cut a strip that's about half the width and laid that up against the edge of the guard. I actually used the manufactured cut edge on the roll of paper. And then I cut the second strip to be a rough fit along the side of the body. And by rough, I mean within sort of 1/8 of an inch, which you can do easily by hand with scissors. And then you use a Sharpie marker and you run that along the edge of the body. And that'll give you a line on that paper that you can then, if it'll focus, you can then trim along and cut out. And then you just sort of shift that piece of paper over, and then I glue the two together. And there's some tape there holding it as well, and some magnets. So that should now give me a really nicely fitting piece. What I'll do is I still need to trim the bottom to match the little curve I've got there. I'll then transfer the outline of these to my sheets of steel and add the extra for the flanges that go down either side. And then I will match them up to the body and drill through the existing holes in the guard here, and then do the same where it matches onto the body of the car. So what I'm hoping is to get this seam here, which is it's steel to steel, so that can be a nice tight bolted together joint. It doesn't need anything in between it. And then I just need the fender welt between the steel and the aluminium off the body. So I'll go ahead and finish these up, get them ready to cut out, and probably not going to make the steel today. I might leave that till tomorrow, but I at least want to have the templates ready and the steel marked out. So I've taken the templates off the car and I've used those to trace out the shape I need to cut out on some sheet steel. One thing to note is when you do this, you need to turn the pattern over and trace around the back side of it. And the reason for that is because the pattern gives me the inner lines here, but I need to add on the flanges around the outside. So you need to draw those on. And then when I run it through the roller there, the bead roller, that will put the little score line in this side of the panel, which means when I hammer up these flanges, they're going to bend upwards like that. So because the flanges go on the underside of the panel, you need to have the panel upside down. And that's why you need to trace around the back of those. You can see these are not quite exactly the same shape, and that's because of the asymmetry in the body of the car. So the next step will be run these through the rollers and then hammer up those flanges, and then using the shrinker, you shrink the flange that you've just folded up, and that will make the panel curve, and then you just sort of match that to the curve of the body. I've now used the bead roller there to put a little, not quite a bend, it's more a sort of seam into the panels here where I'm going to fold up the flanges. And you can see this is looking on the back of one of the panels, if it'll focus on it. It just puts in a little sort of a score line, effectively. This is looking on the top. I just followed these lines. And that just gives me a line to follow, so that when I bend these flanges over, it's automatically going to bend along that scored line. And that's how I can control where the bend is. It just gives me a nice tight bend. So this isn't a very deep score. It doesn't have to be much, because it's just automatically going to bend along that line now. The rollers I'm using are just homemade. This is just a piece of 3mm steel. I think this was actually a piece left over from the middle of a hole saw. I would have been cutting something out. That was just a leftover bit, and just a lump of plastic on the bottom. These aren't keyed to the shafts in any way, they're just held on with those bolts. But that seems to be enough. There's not a huge amount of tension on those. And it's made much easier because I motorized the bead roller. There's just a speed controller in here with a forwards and reverse and a speed control. And to motorize it, I just used a windscreen wiper motor and basically bike chains and sprockets, with a sort of machined up hub here. You can see the sprocket is just sort of, there's a few tacks of weld holding it on, and it was welded around the front as well. And there's just a smaller sprocket up here on the top, and that, if I press the pedal, basically motorizes the machine. And of course with the speed controller, you can control the speed. I could also change the speed using the 2-speed feature of the wiper motor, but I've found that the speed this goes is easily fast enough, or rather slow enough. So that works really well. So the next step is to go ahead and hammer up the flanges on these, which should, you can sort of see that the panel's a little bit distorted at the moment. It's still flat, it's just bent slightly. Once I fold those edges up, it should go back to more or less flat. And then by shrinking the flanges, I can then get it to curve, so I can follow the curve of the wheels and the body. So once again, everything's turned into a huge mess, but I've been working on the new pieces to go between the rear guards and the body of the car. One of the reasons I wanted to remake them is I wasn't too happy with the fit off the original ones I did, and I'd ended up welding an extra piece onto the end there to fill in the gap. I just wasn't really happy with that weld, so I wanted to make new ones that just fit a lot better. So on the steel I cut out, I've folded up the flanges and I've wired the back edge on this one. And you can see once you do that, it goes completely flat and rigid. And then the way I've been curving it, like the original one, is to shrink along these flanges. And that's why I've got the shrinking and stretching jaws here. I need both because sometimes I overdo it and you have to stretch them back out. So the way that I did it is I took the rear guard off the car and I traced around where this flange, or rather this flange, was touching the guard. I traced around it with some chalk, and then I was able to curve the new panel to exactly match that. It took quite a bit of fiddling because obviously the guards have already got holes drilled in them, so I needed to make it so that the new piece of steel, the holes would line up on the flange, and this is only a 1/2 inch flange, so it takes quite a bit of fiddling to make sure that the holes end up in the middle of the flange. And of course one of the tricks there is you just drill all the holes a bit oversized so you've got a bit of wiggle room, but I was actually able to get away without doing that. I think I've got one hole that needs a little tiny bit of filing to get the bolt through, but the rest of them I managed to get to line up quite well. So I still obviously need to do that one, but if we look at the one I've been working on, you can see this one is actually a much nicer fit. I especially wanted to improve the fit between the guard and the steel there, so there's no gap. If I could get away with it, I would prefer not to use fender welt in that seam. I may end up using a smaller kind. It comes in different diameters, and I'll probably be using quite a large one to go in this gap here because this is a bit more complicated, whereas this one is just a flat flange onto a flat surface, so it shouldn't need too much to just tidy up that seam there. I suppose I could actually weld them together, but I'd prefer not to. The other thing I've done is, well, the other thing you have to be careful of is when you fold this panel, you need to shrink it evenly along both flanges so that you don't end up with a sort of twist or warp in it. So this panel needs to be flat, just with a curve in that direction. You don't want any sort of wobbles or anything in it. And that meant I had to be very careful about trying to get these existing holes that are in the body to line up. And you can see this is obviously sitting a little bit low because the two bolts that hold it at the front are quite loose, and that gives me some wiggle room so I can move this up and down. But the fact that these holes are lining up with the edge of the panel there means that I've got it pretty much in the right place. You do get a little bit of flex in it, especially down this lower end. You can twist it to get it to fit. So at the moment, obviously it's sitting low, but if I just pivot that up, I'll be able to mark through the holes into that flange and drill the holes all through accurately. So this is actually quite a complex sort of shape because you've got the body curving in that direction and round as well. So doing the first one and then using that to make a template to make a more accurate second one has worked out fairly well. So there will be, like I say, the fender welt in between here, because also this is aluminium onto steel and you don't really want them touching if you can avoid it. I'm not sure what I can do about the bolts, because again, if you use steel bolts, I'm going to have dissimilar metals, and that's quite likely to corrode eventually. So I may be able to do it with stainless steel bolts through here. The problem is these bolts here are actually quite hard to get to. Obviously you don't need to do it very often, but I think what I can do is with the wheel off, you can get up into there okay, and obviously you've got good access through the boot, so you can get your hand on either side of the fasteners, which would obviously be a lot harder if it was a bigger car. So I'll probably use stainless steel bolts along here just to try and avoid some of that corrosion problem. Steel to steel on here will be fine, I think. What I may end up having to do is, I don't know if you would prepare and paint these separately and then bolt them together, or if it's better to bolt them together and then maybe I can seam seal down through the middle there. I'm not sure. But using normal steel bolts between steel and steel will be fine. So I'll lift this into the right position and using a Sharpie mark through from the body where the holes need to be drilled in the flange, and then all I need to do is drill those holes and I can bolt this back on. Have the new piece bolted in now, and it is a much better fit. I'm a lot happier with that. It follows the body a lot more closely, and it's tight up against the inside of the rear guard there. I did spend ages trying to look for the nuts to bolt it together. I had them all in a little plastic container, which is in there, and then as I was bolting it together I discovered I didn't have enough nuts to actually finish it, and I couldn't figure out where the old nuts had disappeared to. I thought I'd put them down somewhere and lost them, but I'd forgotten that on the first set I made, I actually made the nuts in the top piece here captive, just to make it easier to get them in place. But obviously they're welded on, so I was looking for loose nuts that didn't exist. I have run out of them now, so I'm going to have to order some more. I'm just using these little gutter bolts, or roofing bolts they call them, which are actually BSW threaded, which is kind of interesting. So that's one side done. It's a lot neater at the top because it's all one piece now, so there's not a horrible welded on piece there, and I got the fit here a lot better as well, so there's much less of a hole here, and the fender welt should fill that gap in there quite nicely. So that's one side done. I just need to redo the other side.